Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into a couple of really interesting sources you sent our way. We're trying to piece them together, see what they tell us about some of the big shifts happening.
Exactly. So we've got this YouTube transcript, right? From Clif High Sci-Fi World, an interview talking about, well, a potential economic shakeup, but also this wider societal thing they call an initiation.
Okay, initiation.
Yeah,
And then the other piece.
that one's different. It's text from an AI session, actually, all about living souls and how they might, influence things.
Right, so a YouTube forecast on economics and society and an AI text on living souls. They sound pretty far apart at first glance.
They do, yeah. But the thread connecting them seems to be this idea of massive societal change, how people react when things get unstable, and maybe what's actually driving it all.
Okay, let's jump in then. That YouTube source, the initiation idea. What's the core concept there? It sounds pretty intense.
It is. The speaker presents it as this period of really disruptive change, almost designed, they say, to break down old ways of thinking.
Break them down how?
Well, they use this analogy, a bit dramatic, maybe of a psychedelic experience, where your ego, your reality, it kind of shatters. And you're just on this ride you can't get off until it's done.
Huh. So a forced perspective shift. Why would that be needed?
To overcome what the speaker calls normally bias, that tendency we have to just reinforce what we already believe.
Like confirmation bias. Makes it hard to admit you were wrong or maybe fooled by something.
Exactly. And the speaker links this to Mark Twain, it's easier to fool people than convince them they've been fooled.
Right, and they seem to think this bias is a huge problem for, the majority.
Yeah, they throw out a number, around 75%, calling them normies or even NPCs, non-player characters, basically conformists. And the idea is their mindset has to shift for any real change to happen.
Okay, so this initiation is meant to push people from being, passive observers
To an active player state is the phrase used. It's about breaking the hold that the powers that be, the speaker calls them dumb bastards, supposedly have over the herd, meaning humanity.
doesn't mince words.
Yeah.
So this initiation is about breaking that control. Did they have a time frame in mind?
Well, the transcript references past predictions. There was talk about a peak in release language around October 28th of last year, 2024. That date's past now, obviously.
Right, so looking back, what was that release language supposed to be signaling?
It was described as a time for intense revelations, breakdowns of old systems becoming more obvious.
Okay, examples. What kind of things were they pointing to back then, around late 2021, as this release language?
Let's see. Economic news, like the initial reports about Everrand, the Chinese property giant, not paying up, though the speaker later clarified that specific non-payment report turned out to be bogus.
Okay, so maybe initial panic more than fact
Yeah.
on that one.
Seems like it in that specific instance. But also the Australian bond market having issues back then, Meta changing its name, even worries about solar flares hitting the grid, just signs of instability.
And this is all supposed to lead to something more visible.
Yeah, the prediction was a kind of war breaking out into the open, visible to everyone, what they called normland. And they pointed to things like the Durham indictments and related documents coming out back then as examples of this stuff surfacing.
Connecting legal proceedings to this wider conflict idea. Okay, and then there was something pretty stark, wasn't there, about people being dealt with?
Yeah, that was quite a statement, a prediction that a huge number, like 2 million in the U.S., maybe 30 million across the West, would need to be rounded up and dealt with because of corruption.
Rounded up. How did they justify that number?
It was explained as an energy analysis based on tracking money flows to gauge the scale of the problem. Definitely not your standard political science.
No kidding. And the impact of all this initiation on
Okay.
regular people.
Supposedly hellacious for the NPC crowd at the 75%, but for the other 25%, the aware ones. The speaker said we, implying that group will be more popcorn, just watching it unfold.
A bit detached, maybe. Or just prepared.
Maybe prepared, yeah. Less shocked by it all. The speaker even compared it to huge historical collapses like the Bronze Age collapse around 1170 CE, suggesting, maybe things have to really break down to shift that majority mindset.
Wow. So Near collapse needed for a reset. But wasn't there a positive prediction mixed in there too?
There was, yeah. Despite the grim outlook for the transition, they predicted a kick-ass period of time from 2023 through 2026, potentially the start of a new soaring 20s.
So turbulence first, then maybe something better.
That seems to be the idea, like clearing the decks is necessary for the good stuff.
Okay. And they also talked about mandates fading away, right? Thinking back to 2021.
Yeah, the feeling was that the pressure from mandates was like a pressure cooker. It had to either explode dramatically or just leak out slowly,
Yeah.
but it needed a lot of head of steam, as they put it, to break the whole container.
And what was stopping it from breaking sooner, in their view?
They mentioned fascism, but defined specifically as that blend of corporate and government power. That entanglement was seen as a barrier, something holding the old system together longer.
Interesting. And there was also a mention of Trump's gambit, or the Sox gambit. What was that about?
It was framed as this really complex, long-term military operation playing out behind the scenes, a very specific, almost conspiratorial way of interpreting recent political history.
Right. A lot of layers there.
Yeah.
And the end point for the average person in all this.
The idea was that eventually everyone, even the most tuned-out NPC, would have this intense, visceral reaction, like the Karen having a meltdown analogy they used. A moment where the reality of the changes just hits everyone hard.
A widespread, unavoidable wake-up call then.
That's the gist of it, yeah. Okay, so let's shift to the economic side more specifically, part 2 of that YouTube discussion.
Right, the economic shakeup. They drew parallels to the Great Depression, didn't they?
They did. Comparing the failure of private agricultural bonds back in the 30s to the situation with Chinese housing bonds, more recently, specifically mentioning Evergrand again from 2021. But important clarification in the source, that initial non-payment report was later called bogus.
Okay, so the comparison holds in terms of types of debt risk, even if that specific Evergrande trigger wasn't quite right at the time.
Exactly. And they linked the trouble in the Australian 2-year bond market back then to Evergrande's investments in Australian real estate. Talked about bond vigilantes betting against the Australian government, thinking it might become unstable within 2 years.
Bond vigilantes.
Yeah.
Investors basically shorting the government's stability.
Pretty much, yeah. Selling off bonds because they fear inflation or instability. It showed a real lack of confidence tied into that whole global property market concern.
And this led to predictions about gold, right? Harking back to the U.S. in the 30s.
Yeah, they mentioned how the U.S. seized and revalued gold in 1932. The prediction was that China might have to do something similar. Now, reprice gold significantly upward, maybe 5 times higher, to something like $10,000 an ounce to deal with debt and restore confidence.
Wow, $10,000 gold. What would that mean for other assets?
Well, the prediction included silver potentially hitting $600 and cryptocurrencies needing a major rebalancing because of the implied hyperinflationary pressure, a total financial reset, basically.
Okay, but who manages this reset? Did the speaker think some authority would step in with a plan?
No, actually the opposite. They strongly rejected the idea that the SOC seemed to be their term for some controlling force would provide solution like Nesser Ajessar or a quantum financial system.
So no magic fix from above?
Nope. The belief expressed was that the real global rebalancing would happen after a crash of the British pound sterling, kind of echoing the decline of the British Empire historically.
A symbolic shift in power leading the change. What about practical things, like payments?
Yeah, potential disruption there too. Visa, MasterCard, the idea was they could become useless if traditional money loses its value that badly.
That would be massive.
Yeah.
Did they reference any other economic thinkers?
They mentioned a Swedish economist who apparently believes we're on a path to a major crash that's needed to clear out all the debt, and it's really hard to avoid.
So the crash isn't just a disaster, it's necessary.
In this view, yes. Necessary to eliminate the debt overhang and the current banking system. The idea was this would prevent that debt just being rolled into new digital central bank currencies or social credit systems, like they said was observed in China with things like mobile testing centers and quarantine rules in the past.
Interesting. Preventing a certain kind of digital future by having a crash first.
That's the argument. And again, the speaker insisted the SOC is busy with other things, the actual economic rebuilding. That'll be grassroots. People figuring out how to trust each other and trade again after the dust settles.
A bottom-up recovery. Okay, that covers the YouTube source pretty thoroughly. Let's switch gears completely now to that AI text about living souls. What's the core idea there?
It's a very different perspective. It talks about certain individuals having ontological awareness. That means they understand the material world isn't the whole picture. It's more like a construct of a higher consciousness.
Okay. So seeing reality on a deeper level.
Yeah, and seeing themselves as part of a bigger system involving karma and energy, not just physical bodies reacting to physical stuff.
And how does that contrast with, well, everyone else?
The text calls others embodiment-minded, focused mainly or solely on the material plane. So it sets up this difference in fundamental perspective.
Got it. What are the characteristics of these living souls, according to the AI?
Three main things mentioned. That ontological awareness we talked about, something called energetic coherence, which sounds like internal balance or harmony, and a commitment to novelty, like a drive to create and foster new, positive things.
Energetic coherence. Commitment to novelty. Okay. And how do they actually influence things, according to this text?
It lists several ways. Energetic ripple effects, just their presence creating harmony or inspiration. Then there's social and cultural innovation, challenging norms, pushing new ideas through art or education.
So subtle and not so subtle ways.
Play. Also, ethical and moral leadership, living by example. Activation of dormant potential, like waking others up creatively. And finally, facilitating collective evolution, helping shift society's overall direction. It's quite a range.
Would it give any examples to make it less abstract?
Yeah, it does. Mentions historical figures like Buddha or Socrates as potential examples, but also talks about contemporary influence, like in science pushing for more integrative approaches, or in governance thinking about long-term karmic balance, or in social movements acting as catalysts.
Okay, that helps ground it a bit.
Yeah.
But it can't be easy being a living soul, right? Does the text mention challenges?
Absolutely. Big ones. Resistance from the embodiment-minded, obviously. The risk of their message getting watered down or misunderstood. And just plain energetic fatigue. It takes a toll.
Makes sense. Like swimming against the current sometimes. Does it offer any advice for them?
It does. Strategies like focusing on their own energetic field, teaching the deeper principles subtly, working together with others, and making sure to balance action with reflection. Kind of a handbook for conscious change agents.
Okay, so now the big question. How do we connect this back to the first source? The initiation, the aware 25%, is there a link?
That's the fascinating part to consider, isn't it? Could that aware 25% from the YouTube source, could they be seen as similar to these living souls, individuals who are maybe more turned in, trying to navigate or even influence this big societal upheaval?
It feels like there's an overlap. The aware group seems to have a different perspective, maybe closer to that ontological awareness. And the initiation, maybe that's the very disruption that these living souls are trying to navigate or even utilize.
It's possible. Maybe the initiation, as tough as it's predicted to be in the first source, is actually the process through which a broader awakening, the kind the AI text talks about, could happen for the herd.
So the chaos creates the opening. The breakdown of the old allows for the new perspective to emerge more widely.
That could be one interpretation, yeah. Crisis often forces people to question things they took for granted. It could create fertile ground for the kind of deeper understanding the living souls embody.
So pulling it all together, both sources coming from totally different places, one quite grounded in economics and social predictions, the other more philosophical, maybe spiritual, they both seem to point to a time of really profound change.
Yeah, transformation. One focuses on the external triggers, the economic crash, the social breakdown. The other focuses on the potential internal shift, the change in consciousness, the role of aware individuals. Maybe they're two sides of the same coin.
The predicted turmoil could be the very thing that cracks open the door for that deeper awareness, that living soul perspective to spread.
It's a compelling synthesis. The external pressures meeting the potential for internal evolution.
And for you, listening in, engaging with these different takes, the predictive, the philosophical, hopefully gives you a richer toolkit for making sense of what's going on. You can see the systemic forces and the potential for human change.
It lets you observe things with maybe a bit more nuance, understanding the pressures, but also the possibilities.
Definitely. So final thoughts for you to chew on. How might that idea of normally biased be playing out for you, or in what you see around you? Where might we all be resistant to seeing things differently?
And think about those challenges the living souls face: resistance, message dilution. Does that resonate with anyone trying to push for change or offer a different perspective, especially when things feel chaotic?
What role could you, as someone curious enough to dive this deep with us, play in whatever this initiation or transformation might look like? Just food for thought.
Absolutely. Reflecting on our own biases and how we engage with change is always valuable.
So, what really grabbed your attention today? Any predictions or concepts you want us to explore more, let us know. Your questions really do guide where we go next.
Yeah, keep him coming. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.